The last section of this particular chapter is a little bit of a discussion about gross domestic product and a few of its shortcomings. What does our calculation of GDP omit or leave out? We already said that a higher GDP generally does equate to a higher average standard of living, which is one of the main reasons why countries and government officials like to have a very high GDP value. But does it necessarily say that we are automatically going to have a high standard of living? So we saw that the United States has the highest GDP, about 21 to 22 trillion dollars. Does that mean that the United States automatically has the highest standard of living around the world? We saw that China has the second highest GDP calculation, but does it mean that they have the second highest standard of living? And the answer is obviously not. We know that the standard of living in China is going to be a lot lower than that of even maybe the top 10 or even 20 countries in terms of GDP. So what we want to go ahead and do is see if we can kind of get a little bit of a better calculation of GDP. Can we just adjust our GDP calculation just a little bit to get a better idea of the standard of living, and also discuss a few of the sort of variables that are left out in terms of the standard of living calculation with GDP. So we just noticed that GDP is just a final amount of goods and services produced within a country, but it doesn't really take into account like the environment, life expectancy, happiness. It doesn't take into account income inequality. So there are a lot of variables that our GDP calculation does leave out. So one thing that we can do in order to transform our GDP calculation is to go ahead and account for two different variables. We can account for prices, and we can also account for population. When we account for prices or price differences between countries, we're going to come to a calculation known as gross domestic product purchasing power parity, or PPP. So gross domestic product, PPP, takes into account differences in the cost of living between countries, especially services, to adjust for GDP measures. We know that different countries have different prices and costs for the same exact good or service. However, we do notice that countries that have a very high price or very high cost of living, we notice their GDPs tend to be higher as a result of that. So purchasing power parity is a way to get around this fact and to control for prices or price differences among two different countries. We know that living abroad, maybe in China or in another sort of developing country, the cost is going to be a lot lower to live there. So here what we're doing with purchasing power parity is adjusting for inflation, adjusting for prices to ensure that the price level is the same among both of these countries in order to get a better measure of gross domestic product and the standard of living. We also call purchasing power parity real GDP, and we'll hit on this real impacts in the next chapter a little bit more. We take a look at real GDP rather than just nominal GDP, which is just the GDP calculated according to the income or expenditure approach. Another thing that we can control for is population. So typically in countries that have a very, very large population, GDP also tends to be very high as a result. We see this in China and also India. Huge populations, very, very high GDP. But we want to control for that. So in order to control for population, we're going to use GDP per capita, which takes into account differences in the sizes of countries by dividing GDP by population. So we take the GDP value, whatever it may be in a particular country, and then we divide it by the population within a country in order to get GDP per capita. And this will give us a much better measure of exactly the individual standard of living within a particular country. The gross domestic product per capita just tells us on average how much each citizen within the country should be earning or producing in a given year. So by controlling for these two variables, for population and also for prices, we can actually combine them together. We can get real GDP per capita. It will give us a much better understanding and a much better measure of the standard of living rather than just GDP as a whole. So with this in mind, we will go ahead and take a look at GDP per capita and also real GDP when we hit chapter 6 and chapter number 7 just a little bit more. But this is something to keep in the back of your mind because just GDP by itself is leaving out a lot of different things. In the next video, we'll go ahead and take a closer look at the more variables that are going to be left out or omitted with our typical GDP calculation, which is why we want to rely on real GDP, on GDP per capita, or real GDP per capita, combining both of these. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going to be omitted in the next section.